Hi there, everyone. Welcome back to Chase and Thoughts with Chase. So, today is going to be me doing my quote unquote analysis of the second movie in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. I did the first one last week, and so this week I'm going to do the second one, which is The Two Towers. By the way, just before we get started, real quick, if you have not watched Lord of the Rings The Two Towers, I highly recommend going and watching that before watching this video, because this is not going to be a summary. This is going to be me mentioning random notes I took, which leave out a lot of really important events. And also, I took these notes like 2 months ago, so please forgive me if I misinterpret some of the events. Anyway, I didn't get the exact length of the movie this time because that's usually the first thing I put in my notes. But the movie is nearly 4 hours long. I believe it was 3 hours and 58 minutes, if I remember correctly. And I somehow noted that Gandalf's staff changed from the first movie, but really I think the only thing that changed is that there's a glow. Because for some reason, the first movie starts off with a flashback to when Gandalf does the whole "you shall not pass" thing with the Balrog. And I mentioned this in the last video, but I probably didn't mention much about the lore of the Balrog, but just know that the Balrogs are on the same level of power as Gandalf is. And if something does not make sense, as I said through these notes, it's either because I skipped through the events because I didn't want to take notes of it, or you haven't watched the first video, which I would also, by the way, highly recommend you do before watching this one. So, something to know is that Sam and Frodo at this point are journeying to Mordor by themselves. They've separated from the rest of the party. And then there's Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli who are going to rescue Merry and Pippin, just to set up some basic stuff. Because Merry and Pippin got captured by orcs in the last movie. So, I put in my notes that Sam was bragging about his elvish rope and the fact that his knot was not easy to untie. And then I think it was either him or Frodo. They just tug on it once and it immediately collapses. But also, we do also learn that Gollum is following them. Gollum ends up attacking them, and they do eventually end up subduing him. And Sam actually uses the rope and ties it around him. And apparently, something new is that Gollum hates the elvish rope. He does not like it. He says that it burns him. And you'd think that, obviously, Sam wants to kill Gollum and just get the whole thing over with. But Frodo doesn't want to because he doesn't actually really know how to get to Mordor, and Gollum knows the way to Mordor. So they basically make a deal with him. Hey, we'll let you live if you take us to Mordor. And Gollum agrees. Or more rather, Smeagol agrees to it, which is like Gollum's alter ego from his past. I don't know the deal with the Gollum Smeagol stuff. I don't know the lore behind that. I also put in my notes, for some reason, during a scene featuring Saruman, he mentions the title of the movie, The Two Towers Uniting and Working Together. This is a reference to, obviously, the fact that both Mordor and Isengard are working together to take over Middle-earth. We learned that one of the kingdoms of men, known the kingdom of Rohan, their king is poisoned and cursed by Saruman, by the way. Just this is an important plot point to know for later. He also has a daughter called Eowyn who likes to battle, and then there's also Grima, who's his quote unquote royal advisor, who actually is working for Saruman, but we'll get into Grima a bit later. And also he banished his old son. There's a lot of stuff going on with Rohan. Rohan is very important in this movie and the next, by the way. Just so you know. But as I said, this is more so an analysis on some of the finer details of the movie and not so much a summary of it. But I will try to, make sure I tell you general context details. Now, I obviously mentioned that Merry and Pippin were captured by the orcs, so what's happening with them? Well, the movie shows us a scene where the regular orcs are like, oh, hey, I want to eat Miriam. We want to eat the halflings. But the Uruk-hai, specifically their commander, is like, no, Saruman told us to bring them back alive. And they end up fighting with each other. And eventually they just say, looks like meat's back on the menu, boys. And this end up going on a bit of a whole cannibal scene. I'm not joking about this. As I said, Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas were tracking the Merry and Pippin and the orcs. And just something important to know, I should have mentioned this in the last episode, but because Aragorn is an elvish ranger, he's very good at tracking people. So he was able to pretty easily track them. And so he finds these riders of Rohan, and he basically asks them if they've seen anything about orcs. And they said, oh, we slayed a whole party of orcs the night before. So they go to this place, and they see both Merry and Pippin's clothing. I'm not sure if clothing's the right answer, but they're pins or something. He sees something from them, and for a moment, Aragorn believes that Merry and Pippin are dead. So he kicks a helmet because he's upset about that. But he then looks at it and he's like, wait, they actually freed themselves and then ran into the forest. And this forest is like, I don't know, enchanted or cursed or something. This is not an uncommon thing in Middle-earth, by the way. I just put this in my notes. But eventually they run into someone named Treebeard. That's his actual name, and who is an Ent. And I apparently put some Silmarillion spoilers. By the way, I put a lot of that. The Ents were created by a Valar who made all the plants. And then I put in the sentence afterwards, I put Gollum doesn't eat normal food, because at this point in the movie, it cuts back to Sam and Frodo, and Gollum doesn't like a fish cooked. He just eats a buddy raw. I kid you not. But then again, that's not really super important. And speaking of Sam, Frodo, and Gollum, they're crossing a place known as the Dead Marshes. And apparently there's some lore about the Dead Marshes where a great battle took place a long time. And the fires are deadly because they indicate those who lost their lives. I guess they're also deadly because it's fire and you shouldn't touch it. I do not know what I was thinking when I was taking these notes. Like, I took these notes 2 months ago, guys. Sorry if they're really inconclusive. Okay, I just zoomed in on my notes. Okay, that's fine. Then the next time I took notes, it was after we were introduced to Treebeard, and the fact that he had saved Merry and Pippin from an orc that had decided to be unusually persistent with them. And there's this whole thing with him meeting with the other Ents, I think, that happens later on. But Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli run into Gandalf, who is revived at this point. And I'm just going to go through a real quick synopsis. Basically, he fell down, landed in this, like, ethereal afterlife weird-ish thing, battled the Balrog, killed the Balrog, collapsed from his thing, and then Eru basically sends him back because his mission's not finished. By the way, again, I'm just going to really quickly explain. Eru is basically like the creator in Middle-earth, by the way, just so you know. I might do an episode on all the Silmarillion lore later on, but that's not for today. Today we're talking about the movies. And I also put that Sauron shows fear with what Aragorn can become. And basically, Gandalf reveals this to Aragorn. He's like, Sauron is scared of you because he knows what you're capable of doing. And then I also learned that the elven cloaks actually do camouflage you, because I was a bit surprised by this, because I played the Lego games and I hadn't watched the movies in a while, and I'm like, oh, the camouflage thing must be a game gimmick to make them look special. Nope, they actually camouflage you. And then as I said, my notes are all over the place. So again, I'm really sorry. And then at another scene, Treebeard expresses his lament of not getting laid. This is not like a Gen Alpha joke. This is something that actually happens in the movie. Why I chose to word it like this, I have no idea, but I guess I did. And also, I did mention Grima, the Grima Wormtongue, who was the advisor to the King of Rohan. So we're going to go back to him now, mostly because I put something about his name, because I wanted to know what the word Grima meant. Grima means disgust or unease, and Grima Wormtongue certainly embodies this, because he's really creepy and tries to flirt with the princess, who is not a fan of him for very obvious reasons. And of course, and also Gandalf joins Merry and Pippin, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, because he needs to go to Rohan to cure the king of Rohan. I can't remember his name. I don't think I put the name in correctly. But they go over to cure him, and Gandalf disguises himself as Gandalf the Grey again. So he doesn't reveal that he's actually ascended to be Gandalf the White. He's just still Gandalf the Grey too. And Grima's like, oh, hey, if you want to meet the king, you have to give me all your weapons. But somehow he convinces the person at the door to let him through with his staff, which leads to a really funny scene where Grima is like, the staff! I told you to get the wizard's staff! And Saruman speaks through the king, basically saying, haha, you can't get me out without killing him. And Gandalf basically goes, lol, psych, I got a power boost since the last time we met each other. Cleanses the king after a bit of a difficult battle, and Saruman's probably really annoyed by this. Gandalf, at this point, rides off to go get Éomer, because I believe the orcs are coming to invade the area. So the king decides to go to a stronghold in the mountains, because he believes it's a more defensible position. Gandalf's like, no way I'm doing that. I'm going to go get Éomer, your son that you banished, and see if we can get some backup. Which is something that happened, by the way. But as I said, I put my notes all over the place. It's been 2 months since I watched the movie. I can't actually remember it. And this was never really meant to be a summary in the first place. It was meant to be analysis of the deeper details. I put a diss that I at least think that Smeagol appears to be a somewhat separate entity to Gollum. And I don't really know where Gollum comes from, and I'm a bit too lazy to do the lore research right now. I'll probably post a short about Gollum once I do the research. He also has an unusual knowledge of what Sauron's intentions are, but I guess that mostly comes from him being tortured in Mordor before the events of the story. And by the way, I just put the next part of my notes. This was just a shock to me when I learned this. Aragorn is 87 years old. 87. And he doesn't look a day older than 30. And this is because he's a Dúnedain, a descendant of Numor who's been blessed with long life. And I think he's one of the last living members of the Dúnedain, but I'm not sure about that. Because Treebeard is really slow and relaxed, it once again cuts to him taking care of Merry and Pippin, and he describes Saruman as having a mind of metal and wheels, which I believe is a phrase used in the books to describe Saruman as well. I put the best interpretation I put at the time was that this was probably used to describe his industrious mind being used to further his own goals at the detriment of nature. And I've realized this is like a complete opposite contrast to someone like Radagast the Brown, who's in The Hobbit, who's like very nature-centric, where Saruman is more technological and has no problems exploiting the land to get what he wants. At this point in the story, anyway. And then I skipped over some events in my notes, but I believe Frodo, Sam, and Gollum wind up around Osgiliath, all get captured, and we kind of learn why Boromir was even at the council in the first place. First off, it should be noted that Boromir was not a bad person, nor did he have bad intentions, because the first movie kind of might give you that impression, but he was assigned by his father to go claim the One Ring for Gondor. And also because the ring has to tempt literally anyone who comes in with 3-meter radius of it. His brother Faramir, aka the less loved brother by his father, is also tempted by the ring once he comes into contact in it. And then I skip over some really more important lore in my notes somehow about the fact that the Uruk-hai decide to go invade this stronghold that the King of Rohan retreated to. I cannot for the love of me remember his name. Someone in the comments, please remind me. Please. So that I can use... And I also mentioned that how the way that the way Aragorn commands the elves that come and assist them mirrors Elrond's commands in the prologue. And also at this point, I heard the Wilhelm scream at some point in the movie. And by the way, this is not the last time you hear it in. It's heard, I think, at least twice in this movie, but seriously, that sound is everywhere. Now, Merry is concerned about the fires of Isengard spreading, though the Ents just say, well, we'll weather through it. Again, I am skipping over so much, but essentially Treebeard takes them to the other Ents. They all have a council, and it takes them like an entire day to say hello, and I think that's hilarious, but the Ents don't really want to fight. And there's a specific lore reason as to why they're so hesitant to do so. It has something to do with how they're tied to nature. Same with the elves, by the way. But again, that's getting into some Elrond territory. I don't really want to get into that territory, so yeah, we're not going to get any further than we have to. But they do change their minds once they see, like, what exactly Saruman has done to the area surrounding Isengard. So they're like, okay, a wizard should know better. So Treebeard leads and basically an all-out assault on Isengard at this point. And meanwhile, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli are with Rohan, and they're struggling to hold back the I can't remember the name. Hold back the Uruk-hai from breaking in. But just as they think, hey, maybe we're getting somewhere, the Nazgul arrive on freaking dragon, which is just something they have now. Because, yeah, sure, why not? They weren't scary enough as is. An ethereal being that is basically impossible to kill. Oh, sure, let's give it a dragon. I'm sorry, I just went on that rant. However, luckily, they do eventually make it through, and Gandalf finally arrives with support to drive back the Uruk-hai, and with the, meanwhile, on the Ents end, with Merry and Pippin, they decide that their play is to go release a dam that Saruman made just outside of Isengard, which releases the river that floods the entire area and basically wipes away pretty much everything that Saruman made up to this point. And then again, I forgot to mention anything about Sam and Frodo for like 5 or 6 paragraphs. Legitimately, I am terrible at taking notes and making it coherent. I am so sorry. But at this point, Faramir got tempted by the ring. He didn't fall to the temptation, though, and he helps them escape from Osgiliath after it gets invaded. And around this point, the ring is really starting to take a toll on Frodo, and Frodo almost ends up stabbing Sam using Sting. But Sam makes a whole emotional speech about how darkness seems powerful, but it's only momentary, and the light afterwards is brighter for it. It's a really good speech. I can't explain it better through my notes. By the way, if I ever do a movie review again, I will be sure to take way more thorough notes. It's just really hard to take thorough notes when you have to stop every 5 minutes to take notes anyway, and the movie is like 3.5 hours long. But yeah, if I ever do this, if I do the Hobbit one, I will be sure to do a much better job at taking notes about the general plot, as well as the more intricate details. So I also just put that after the battle on Isengard, Pippin and Merry just go right back to being silly, because of course they do. And then the last note I put was that at around the end of the movie, Frodo and Sam have a moment where they wonder if they'll be mentioned in Tales later on for their thing. And then we see that Gollum plans on killing both Sam and Frodo and taking the ring for himself. I'm not sure if Smeagol's like all the way on board, but Gollum specifically seems to be all in towards the idea. I'm so sorry about lacking eye contact during that entire time. I was more focused on the sound than I was at actually staring at the camera and staring at my notes, because I can't print out the notes to not stare at the computer. So, yeah. Anyway, I hope this episode's definitely a lot shorter than the last one, I just realized, which will mean a bit of an easier time editing for me, but that's beside the point. I don't really have anything else I can say about the second movie. I took these notes 2 months ago. They're meant to be a little tidbit and trivia. Yeah, so if that didn't make sense, just know it's because I probably should have done this video sooner. Anyway, thank you for listening to this episode of Chasing Thoughts with Chase, and I can't wait to see you next time where I'll talk about the third movie, and then I'll finally get to something I actually have good notes for. Bye.